evening, everyone. I want to welcome you and call the Finance Committee meeting for August 16th, 2021 to order. The purpose of the meeting this evening is the potential conversation or continued conversation about a TIF for Sylvania, or TIF standing for Tax Increment Financing. Mr. Sanford provided a brief update. We've had some conversations about that for the downtown footprint brought up by Michelle Johnson. And so we had lots of conversations surrounding this, and what we're attempting to do now is look at this more closely and decide whether we want to advance and move this forward or not. So, Mr. Sanford, if you could give us an update of kind of where we stand with this, and I know we've got a nice looking map on the wall here on the smart board, so that would be great.
I'd be glad to, Mr. Fry, and Leslie's going to help too with some of the finer points here to understand the TIF and how it would work. Kevin put together this so we could have a whiteboard presentation instead of just a bigger than what I handed out the last meeting. The red is the area that was designated for our downtown study, and that was the area that Michelle had targeted when she gave examples of what a TIF could do. I included, and it's the same thing you saw at the last meeting about the areas, these other areas, because the TIF can be up to 300 acres. I'm not very good at this, but I asked Kevin, and he guessed. Mayor's pretty good at this too. It looks about 100 acres, just eyeballing. So why not look at it? Because the bigger the area you have, then the more of the tax that would go into the TIF. Again, I think the basic, what we need to do today, or we want to have the discussion, you know, as Mark said, if we're going to do this, if we are going to do it, what is the term? Is it 10, 20, 25 years, 30 years? And then what is the area? So those are the two big items I think we need to discuss. Maybe, Leslie, if you could talk a little bit about what you learned about the terms and what happens with those situations, and then I can...
Yep, sure. Thanks, Bill. One thing in addition to the length of time is also the percentage of the exemption. If council chose to create a TIF that was for a period of 10 years and up to 75% exemption, that does not require school board approval. If it's any longer than that, or if the exemption is any greater than that, that's when we have to negotiate an agreement and the schools have to approve it. So I think those are the considerations: the term, the percentage of the exemption, and the area, the geographic area that, as Bill mentioned, cannot be more than 300 acres.
And I did reach out to the schools, and I've talked to Dr. Motley and Lisa Shanks, the treasurer. Just a couple things that we've scheduled a meeting on August 31st with the two of them. And Lisa told me that she has reached out to an attorney that she had gotten direction from, who has a specialty in TIFs and working with school districts. So because she didn't know much about them. Dr. Motley does. She has worked with TIFs in previous positions she's had. So that's kind of where we're at, Mark. Maybe I know we should, if there's questions we can answer.
So I'm sure everyone's stunned that I have questions. So just to set the table to make sure that we're getting this on the public record again, if a location inside this TIF that would be passed pays $1,000 a year in property taxes, and we initiate the TIF, and the property taxes go from $1,000 to $1,100, the $1,000 still goes to all the people that were getting it before, broken apart. The only thing that we as the city would have access to is a portion of the $100 of the increase in the property taxes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And,
And then there's a breakdown, again, depending if the schools. And the current situation, I looked up some properties that, for instance, there's a property I looked at in downtown that 56% of their property tax goes to the school system. So it'd be the balance of that, and you are right. And then there's things like Olander, Sage Yard, the Metro Parks, Tarda today. Those are, and if we have a TIF longer than 10 years, it'll keep me straight here, then those groups do not, they would not get that added income. They would get what they're getting with that $1,000 in your example, but if it went to the 1,100, then that rest of the money that would go into the TIF.
so if we strike a deal with the schools to go beyond the 10 years, basically whatever that percentage split is, whatever that is, one piece goes to the schools, the other piece goes to the city for the purposes of developing the downtown footprint, or in this case, what we're considering is the downtown footprint, correct?
Correct. The monies collected in the TIF for a specific area has to be used in that area then.
Right. And if we don't strike a deal with the school and we do the 10-year and 75% piece, the $100 in the hypothetical example I'm talking about here, is that still 75% to the city and 25% to the schools? Or is that broken down by the standard structure inside property taxes as they sit today?
I believe that in that example, it's not, we wouldn't get 100% of the $100. It
Right.
would be 75% of that $100.
The remaining $25,
That gets reallocated and distributed pursuant to however their property taxes are.
okay. And so if we've got this circumstance and the house goes up in value inside this footprint, or the business goes up in value, I know there's a difference between inside millage and outside millage, but for the extent of the natural growth of property taxes over time for inside millage, which means their taxes would go up naturally anyways, we would capture some portion of that under the TIF, correct?
That would be correct.
Okay. If the school district passed a levy, or somebody else passed a levy that added 1 mil to the property taxes, and it was approved by the voters, we would capture that millage?
I believe that's true. I believe that's what Michelle said.
Okay.
Yes. Mhm.
That was my understanding as well. I'm
Yes.
just trying to make sure.
Yep, yep. I believe that's
Only in
true.
the TIF area.
But
Right,
only in the TIF
yes,
area, that's correct.
Or would get
Mhm.
most of the funds from
Mhm.
outside the TIF,
Right,
because most of it's outside the TIF.
Right, absolutely.
Inside the TIF, that means
Yeah, because there's, the school district is much, much, much larger area,
Right,
obviously
than-
geographically,
then 100
than
acres.
the 100
yeah.
acres we're talking about here. So, I understand that piece of it. It's also, I want to make sure that it's on the record for, in case anybody's reviewing this video or the recording. Whatever we're talking about doing here does not raise anybody's property taxes by 1 nickel, whether we do the TIF or we don't do the TIF. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, if the valuation increases, they're going to pay a higher tax, but we're not raising anybody's taxes.
All we're doing is capturing a sliver of that to allocate that for additional development.
Correct.
And once we've established this, assuming that we do, we can then bond against that, is that correct? For projects if we so chose?
Yes, that is true. Use that as, to borrow against.
Or we could just use the ongoing,
For a
or we
project,
could use the
yep.
ongoing revenue for
Correct.
projects as we saw fit on an ongoing basis.
Yep.
But it has to be used inside the footprint.
Inside that area, yes.
So why the selection of the 100 acres if we've got 300 acres to work with?
And again, I was based on the plan that Michelle followed, and that's where I went from. I looked at this. Could we expand it? Yes, and it- when it looked here, you know, we're up against the cemetery on the one side, and you get into the neighborhoods to the north and west of downtown. There could be some growth, you know, heading in some other areas if you wanted to look at that, but I think you try to have the one I've looked at a lot was the downtown Toledo one, and theirs was a pretty, you know, it's about a 10, 12 block area that they have in downtown that they've targeted for their TIF, and then they have a 30-year TIF. And they worked out a percentage with the school system.
Right. But why wouldn't we do this?
I'm guessing we could. I'd like to probably run that by Michelle and see what she thought, if it's a little bit farther out of the area.
No, I'm not talking about the expansion, I'm talking about doing the TIF at all. I mean, what would drive us not to want to do this, in your mind?
I think we should do it. I don't know why we wouldn't at this point, based on what the study's telling us and what's going to happen, and we're starting to see the pricing of property increase, and it's just I mean, it's a tool that a lot of communities use, and it makes sense for us to utilize that and going forward and help pay for some of the projects and things that we want to do.
So the TIFs that you're familiar with was the city of Toledo. That percentage split between the city and the schools was what?
The percentage for the Toledo downtown TIF is 67.5% is what they pay for the schools in the downtown Toledo. Michelle, when I shared that number with her, she thought it was a high number compared to other TIFs that she's worked with.
So they get $2 out of every $3. The schools keep $2 out of every $3 for the incremental value, and the city retains $1 out of every $3.
And again, and the advantage, and Leslie and I talked a little more about this, the 10-year one, we don't have to worry about working out a deal with the schools, but if you go for the longer time period, that's when, because we have to have their agreement with the TIF and what we would go forward if it's going to be like a 20, 25-year TIF.
Right, but if we're gonna bond something to do a material project longer than 10 years, or massive amounts of growth, property taxes, which probably isn't likely inside of 10 years. Go ahead, Mr. Hanum.
Yeah, I assume you only get you have an increased valuation in the property. Right?
That is correct.
And the auditor looks at that, every 3 years?
3 years, correct.
So if we pass this today, I think she's doing revaluations right now, right?
I think so, correct.
So we would see nothing probably next 3 years. So if we do a 10-year deal,
Right.
we're really looking at 7 years of.
One other point, since you brought that up, Mr. Hanum, if there is a project, or if there's a property in the TIF district that receives CRA, that does not count. So if we did a 10-year CRA and a project receives a 15-year abatement, we would really never capture any of that increased valuation. Just so that everybody's aware of how the TIF interacts with the CRAs.
But to follow up with that, Doug, she did advise that the sooner the better, because then you're kind of on that ground floor that the property values are at the lower number.
Right.
Because if you wait and delay it, then you're not going to see as much here. It's going to take longer to realize then the difference.
Well, I think they're doing a revaluation this year, right?
But that revaluation is for 2002, correct?
I believe so, yes.
So if we pass this year, would potentially start to some incremental revenue if that's for 2020 taxes, if we pass this in 2020.
Mark, I think that the county has to have it approved or sent to the state.
I wonder about that,
By
but-
September 1st. So you'd be cutting it real close.
Run that past me again, Mr. Schroyer.
I believe I read that the county has to send the reevaluations to the state to get approved by September 1st. And then the state has a couple months to approve it from there. So they may have them already packaged and ready to go. And
So
if we
we're gonna
miss,
do,
if we miss out on this one, which theoretically is gonna be the big one, 3 years from now, it's probably not gonna be, seems to be the big one that everyone's talking about.
right,
Mr. Fryer, I have a couple quick questions.
Go
And
for
I feel like we've asked these questions before, so they'll be easy answers. How many times can we expand the TIF footprint? You know, there's 300 acres. Does it not matter? We can come back until we've accomplished a TIF of 300 acres, or is there a limited number of times?
I think it's the term. I don't think, and Leslie, correct me, I don't think you can, if we established a 20-year in a specific area, nothing changes for 20 years. After 20 years, then I think you start over again.
So what would happen if you wanted to expand, though, to a completely different area that's not currently in the TIF? You could do
You
that.
couldn't, you could not, that would
Just
either
step.
be a different TIF
That's-
or you can't change the area.
So that's the point. You can have a different TIF that is contiguous to the footprint of the current TIF?
I don't,
That, I don't know that. I know we're limited, it could be based on population. I know that's how,
Okay.
you know, we can, for instance, we can only have one DORA. Other bigger cities can have more, but I can certainly look
Just
into that.
curious about
Yeah,
that.
yep, I will definitely research that and let you know.
any questions?
I was wondering this. I had this.
contiguous, we could do that. Ask Kevin to get more on the acreage and where we could go. Help with appropriate areas. If you remember the numbers that Michelle put in the report, they were pretty big numbers, and that was based on redevelopment that we expect to happen in the red area. I think some of the other changes, you go back and you look, and it might have just been the reevaluations, and then it's just a percentage. I mean, it's something, but it's not the big numbers that you could have. So I'm sure we could identify the properties and just look at a percentage increase and see what that would mean for all the properties involved. We could do some homework on that and get an idea, find out from the auditor and confirm the stuff that Toby's talking about, their deadline and everything.
So if somebody was inside the TIF and they bought a piece of property, knocked the building down, put something else up, didn't ask for CRA for whatever reason, or wasn't qualified for it, what have you, that would be a basis effectively of 0, correct? For property tax TIF calculation purposes?
It would have some value, it just would be low, but the new value would be much higher.
Because it would be based on the land.
Correct.
So like the
Right.
somebody built value in the
Yes, that's probably the maximum use of it.
But I think Katie's question is a good one, which is essentially how large is, obviously, there's lots of hypotheticals, if this occurs, if that occurs, but just to have a sense of how big the bucket could be, I don't know about other members of council, but it would be helpful for me to understand how big the current bucket is. You know, is current property taxes $2 million a year for this ground, or is it, $200 a year? I'm assuming it's closer to the former than the latter, but I don't really have a sense of that at this point. To get a sense of, even a small amount of compounded growth. We're gonna be looking at some major projects. again, to Katie's point, are we planting flowers, or are we doing something that's, it's much more costly potentially, or do we have the potential to do something that's much more costly?
Mr. Fry,
Yes, sir.
this is directly from the Lucas County Treasurer's website, and it says, we will have the information on the revaluations available for review until September 1st, 2021. At the completion of that review, values will be sent to the state of Ohio for final approval, and then the final amounts won't be known till December. So what, we'd have to get it to them. If you're trying to get it in before, they call it the triennial 2021, so it's 2021 taxes payable in 2022.
Okay,
My guess is it's probably a little late to
late
get
then.
this one, and.
right.
And you asked why wouldn't you do it before? But if you think about it, you're taking money from all these other organizations and redistributing it to the school if you go that route, and then also to the downtown area. So there's definitely could be some negatives. I assume some of those other organizations are not going to be thrilled with that.
Right. Any other questions from members of council?
I recall about a curious about what the
We can look into that to be sure, but I think that it would just fall into some of our capital projects that we've had earmarked for that area. We've talked a lot about the streetscape in downtown. Kevin's probably got a lot of other different projects that, water, sewer, whatever, intersections. I mean, there's a lot of different things that could identify and look at that, but it just would have to be in the area. But as to the planning and all that, I think you start first with the, defining and collection period, and then you can figure out, and we can get more exact answer on how to target specific projects.
I just wonder if we do try to
But regardless of what we can or can't use it on, definitely gonna have to put this into a separate fund, correct? I mean, there's gotta be a separate accounting for these dollars being spent, otherwise, there's no control on it.
Yes, it is a separate fund.
Okay,
And just the clarification, and what Toby's saying is correct about the other entities with the tax, but they would still be getting something. It's not an abatement. They would get based on what they're getting right now. They just wouldn't be getting the increase of value
understood.
tax. Again, the majority, the lion's share of the property tax goes to the school system.
Do we have to know how we're gonna spend this before we implement the TIF, or?
In reading that one in Toledo, I think they were pretty broad in what they were saying, what they were gonna use. They didn't have an exact projects. They just said it would
Okay.
go to it. I do not think you have to have that all planned out.
Okay.
So something like general improvements for the area included in the TIF may or may not be close enough?
Right, I think that the project has to be identified when the legislation is passed, but we can be pretty general. There's, there is a public hearing requirement, and even if we wanted to do the September 1st, try to meet that deadline, there's no way we could, because there's timing, there's 30-day notice requirements and a public hearing requirement, so.
Yeah, there would definitely need to be a time period. I envision myself going and talking to all the properties that are in, arranging meetings that they can come in. If you're in the TIF area, explaining how it works, and then also talking to all the entities that currently receive the property tax, so they know what's happening.
I think Doug mentioned it earlier, though, if we're not gonna get it in time for this time, it's not gonna increase again unless there's some construction for 3 years, so we would waste 3 years of not collecting anything in most general if we started it now.
I wonder if the date is actually September 1, or when state approves, it gets submitted on September 1.
It says they're submitting it to the state on September 1st.
Yeah, and if the state disapproves it, then that, you go back to ground zero?
I don't know that process from
Yeah,
the state's
my point
of
is,
view.
I think we shouldn't assume that September 1st is a drop dead date.
I agree, Doug, because when I talked to Michelle, she said she was advising the sooner you can do it, the better, just based on the whole changing of the evaluations.
Well, if we slow roll this thing, there's always the possibility that there is some other piece of the puzzle which would materially change in property value. And let's use something that we know is anticipated to occur shortly, which is the expansion of inside the 5. The incremental property taxes attached to those, that addition that's going to go on to that facility, it's not gonna be a titanic sum of money, but it's not gonna be nothing either in regards to that. Those are the kinds of things which create the revenue streams to be able to potentially do projects of a material nature, correct?
Mr. Fry, most likely in a project like that, though, they will apply for the CRA. It's a lot better deal for them, and then they won't get both. So any major project like that, most likely they're gonna go for the CRA, correct, Leslie?
I don't know.
I mean, it's
In
their
that spec-
decision, but
Right, in the inside the 5 case, I have not discussed that with them. They haven't asked for an application. I don't know.
The only CRA that's been discussed is with SOMO.
And that's for how long?
15 years.
But once that's up, then it goes on the tax rolls and the TIF will kick in. Correct, yeah, obviously, yes. Any other questions of council?
Yeah, I mean, what is the thinking in terms of terms, and, I mean, do we want to do a 30-year and do a deal with the school board? Is that what we're thinking?
I'd like to get some more information in kicking this around. Again, if they're gonna be reasonable and work with us, then I'd like the idea of the longer one, because you could realize more. If you did the 10-year, the downside of that is that then everything changes. You could do 10 and then do another 10, but then, that you don't have as big of a jump in probably the valuation. So starting and
Well,
having
you go
this.
back to zero. Right.
Right.
So the, Umami has a TIF, I believe, right?
I think they do, yes.
Yeah. Interesting to know what their deal is. Right.
And definitely, having a conversation with the auditor's office is needed, because that sounds like the same thing a lot of property residents have done, challenging some of the revaluations. I'm sure that goes on.
heard from homeowners that say they've been told it's gonna be between 15 and 20% increase. The state's numbers are pushing for 20%, and Ms. Lopez is trying to get it lower than that. Would the businesses fall under the same category? I don't know, that's for a residential home, but this year's gonna be a big increase, I think, for most people.
It's important, though, to recognize that inside millage will increase based upon the percentages that you're referring to, Mr. Short, but outside millage is a static number. So if you're collecting $500 a year from this levy, and the property value goes up 20%, you're still collecting $500 for that levy. That's the difference between millage and effective millage, correct? So and I agree with you, the property's definitely going up, some taxes are going up, but there's only 10 mils of inside millage max, if I recall correctly, correct? Okay. Any other questions from members of council?
Okay, well, what's our next step?
My understanding is Mr. Sanford has a meeting scheduled before the end of the month with the schools.
Yes. I'd like to have that meeting and then follow up on some of the questions that were asked tonight and report back.
Have like a, I mean,
Um,
50/50?
It could be, you know, I think it all depends on what, how that.
Let's see what Mommy's is, and let's do some more research on that, I would.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yep.
No, typical that,
I think it's also helpful to know what the schools are paying, what the schools are getting on a percentage now for footprint we're considering. So if they're getting 55% today, then it seems to me that asking for more than 55% tomorrow on a TIF is a bridge too far. All we're doing, trying to, over the long term, increase the property values, development of the city.
Right.
So it would be helpful to know that when you walk through the door, what is the current split for the schools versus all the rest of the people that are in the bucket. But as for a time frame on reporting, once you have the meeting, I think it's important to circle back around and to start to inform us on what that conversation looks like. I don't know whether that's something that need to have another committee meeting over, but we certainly, I would think, unless other members of committee would disagree, want reporting, and at least from this person's perspective as a member of council, I'd like to move this as expeditiously as we possibly can, recognizing that there is there's a possibility we're gonna be static for a couple of years while development kicks in, and we start to receive revenue project.
Or we may be able to still get in ahead of the,
Maybe we can.
We'll check all that out and report back. I'm sure by our next council meeting, we'd be able to give an update.
Now, Bill, I feel like you also made some comments about a few things you wanted to check with Michelle. I don't remember what they were.
Just with her, and again, this discussion started from our plan, and it was included in that, and just to follow up with her on her thoughts and the timing, because she has worked with these in other communities.
I think it would be really helpful to have that conversation before our next committee meeting, if that's what we do as well, just so we have her feedback at that point.
Right. I mean, and again, on the plus side, it's in a lot of communities, and they've worked out deals with their school systems, so I'm not, I don't want to sound like that's impossible to do. I'm sure we could get that worked out, because again, many communities have these, that they're effective, and they work with their school system. So,
You know if Perrysburg has one?
I think they do, but we'll find out.
The terms offhand, but we can actually go on the Department of Development's website and look at all the agreements in both counties.
Armed with that information.
Yeah. I'm sure there's some strategy around it that would be beneficial to be aware of. Look into.
Anything else?
maybe just add, Mark, if anybody thinks of anything after the meeting, just send me an email and we'll make sure to include it in what I report back on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanford. Mr. Schreier, I appreciate the information as well. Anything else regarding this matter? None, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Seconded, any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion carried. We're adjourned at 7:07 PM. Thank you very much.